Thanks very much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. And thanks very much for joining us for this debate today on procuring well-being. Many of you will know that we've been discussing some of these issues for close to 20 years now. And it was nearly 10 years ago that we had a major independent audit of our procurement function in Wales under the name of the McClelland Report, which I think was published back in 2012. And that raised some of the fundamental issues that we are still dealing with today. Among other things, McClelland identified weak procurement capability, particularly outside the health service. And he was especially concerned about it in local government, where he found 15 of our 22 local authorities had weak or very weak capability. That he traced to a skills deficit. And he also traced it to the status of the procurement function in organisations. For example, that probably nowhere in Wales was the procurement director reporting directly to the chief executive. One of the indices of the status of procurement, that it needs to be in the boardroom and not in the back room, as we say. And all these weaknesses, I suppose, come down to leadership, the need for really good leadership to raise the status of procurement. So these are the issues that we've been discussing for close to 20 years. They're issues that Jane and Sophie will be discussing. But before I hand over to Jane, I'd like to just mention the fact that Cardiff University is really proud to be able to say that it's about to sign the first memorandum of understanding with Sophie Howe's office to promote sustainable development in Wales. And procurement, public procurement, is one of the pillars of that MOU, which will be signed, I think, in September. So on that lighter note, can I now hand you over to Jane and Sophie? Jane.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. My role at Cardiff Business School is Reader in Procurement. So just to help set the context a little bit about this event, I'm just going to give you a tiny bit about my background. So like most of my academic colleagues, I teach a variety of undergraduate, postgraduate and executive programs, and I'm engaged in research. My areas being procurement and supply chain collaboration, but mostly thrive on the engagement roles with industry practitioners. And for that, I'm the practice and impact lead for the IRSPP, which is the International Research Study on Public Procurement. I provide academic support for 2 knowledge transfer partnerships, working with third sector organisations to address issues in child social care. And other roles include Chair of the South Wales CIPS branch, a long-standing judge panel for Go Awards Wales, and a Senior Associate for Institute for Collaborative Working. Most of our discussion this morning is founded on the initial findings of a procurement review, which is available online in the 2020 Future Generations Report. The spotlight on procurement can be found on pages 127 to 150. I'm delighted to work in partnership with the Future Generations Office and Sophie Howe. And I'd like to offer thanks to one of my graduates, Alice Horn, who's put tremendous effort into this procurement review, and I know she's listening online today. So one of my earliest observations in research has been the issues with terms and their different interpretations of the meanings. And this is one of the first conversations that I had when we started this particular piece of research. Sustainability, for example, has some strong foundations in environmental initiatives such as reducing water, energy and carbon. Sustainability today, though, has become much more philosophical, covering a wider arena, including societal, economic, environmental and cultural factors. The growth in interest in creating societal impact is not new, and much of the earlier research addressing social problems is by Joseph Rowntree, dating right back to the early 1900s. Today, though, all we seem to be hearing about is social value. How are you embedding your social value? I supervised an MBA student last year, Alison Walters, who as part of her research identified 17 clear but different definitions of social value. I've added another 4 to this list, and I don't dare say I'll just keep building on. So our focus on optimising societal impact and how that adds value in the organisation has pulled our attention towards well-being.
I'm just going to kick off then with the reason why we've had this spotlight on procurement, and Kevin has really sort of outlined a bit of the background to all of the various initiatives on procurement. I think for some people who've been in the profession or in this space for a number of years, it sort of feels a bit like Groundhog Day. But of course, it's only since 2016 that we've had these new legal requirements around the Future Generations Act, which really does shift the focus of procurement beyond that, what was it, 17 plus 4 definitions of social value to this statutory definition around 4 pillars of well-being, 7 well-being goals. And the statutory guidance in relation to the Future Generations Act specifically outlines procurement as one of the corporate areas of change where we really need to be seeing that connection back to meeting national well-being goals and local objectives. And over the last 12 months, therefore, we've been working with Cardiff University through this memorandum of understanding, really to try and understand how that is happening in practice. And, a lot of the findings, I suppose, are not going to be of great surprise to anyone. A lot of the intractable problems over many years we're still seeing. But I suppose the kind of key issue that we found is that there are a number of opportunities being missed to procure in a way which supports the delivery of the wellbeing objectives set by individual public bodies. And that's a real problem. It was a problem before COVID and before the likely huge squeeze we're going to have on public spending, but it's going to be even more of a problem if the predictions in terms of the impact on the economy and on public service spending and so on post-COVID are right, because we need to be making sure that £6 billion that we spend is being spent in a way which is trying to meet the aspirations of the Wales that we want to leave behind to our children and our grandchildren, that is not storing up longer term problems for them. And is really kind of cost effective and resource effective and efficient. So I know that so Jane worked in partnership with Alice and Ergine in my office to conduct a initial phase of research in terms of this procurement review. We were about to, we had just triggered the statutory Section 20 review to look at some public bodies in more detail based on either information they supplied or in some cases information they didn't supply. And we paused that in light of COVID because public bodies are not in a position to be able to respond fully at the moment. But we have got this really useful research phase which does expose a number of issues, hence why we want to do a bit more focusing down on some of them. So I'm just going to ask Jane to explain, how we went about starting this review and the research phase, what approach we took and so on. So over to Jane.
Thank you, Sophie. So we adopted a typical research-led approach by first needing to understand the existing published knowledge in this area. It was important to reflect on the scholarly research on sustainability, social value and well-being, so we use key terms to identify the papers in that area. And where possible, then look at those in the context of public procurement. Obviously, there's a lot written on sustainability in public procurement and a lot of linking towards social value, but less in the area of well-being. So this is a relatively new area of development in academic research. After that, the research process formed 3 main stages. Due to the COVID crisis period, though, we've been forced to pause at the second stage. The process of iteration and triangulation, for those of you who are familiar with academic research, was really critical, particularly in phase 1 and especially in phase 2, when we had a lot of data that we were managing. So phase 1 really involved desk-based research. So Alice, I know, trawled through absolutely hundreds of PIN notices and contracts using the Sell to Wales portal. And she examined these, looking for reference to wellbeing goals, or the 5 ways of working. The websites of 44 public bodies were scrutinised, focusing mainly on the strategy, vision and the objectives of each of those organisations. And at this point, I must just thank Dr. Karen Wantner for supporting this part of the research process. Alice and Jürgen, I know, attended numerous events, which were really helpful to try and raise awareness of the review and to develop contacts with procurement professionals. These events were also helpful to establish best practice examples. And we know there are some world-class examples in Wales, but do you know what? One of the challenges I've often come across over the years is persuading people to share them. That can be sometimes quite challenging. I never quite understand why that is. Academics, you know, as you know, how do we sort of manage all this data? We all love a good spreadsheet. So that was typically how we started to go about that process. And in the good old days when we were working in our offices, some of my colleagues were really envious because I actually had a whiteboard wall. So I definitely recommend getting the special paint in your homes if we're going to be working from home for the foreseeable future. It's great fun, but I have to say, I'm sure Alice will agree, it was instrumental in helping us to really map out some of this data on this huge wall, to think about how we would code it and so on. So we coded the responses, identified some of the common themes that were coming out relating to the ways of working and or the wellbeing goals. So we were looking at from a whole range of different spectrum here. And from this evidence, we established 2 fundamental research questions. And those questions then had to pass through a series of different board discussions to make sure that different panels agreed that these were the right questions to be asking. And eventually then these were then used as part of a letter invitation to the chief executives of each of the 44 public bodies, where we asked for evidence to support the impact of wellbeing and how we see that being embedded into procurement. So again, the second stage of the review was really consolidating all of the evidence that which was being sent to us by email. And we set up a special email account for this, by the way. And we then again started the recoding process and again trying to address common themes. This actually took us quite an awful long time to do that. And we really did look at it in lots of different angles. So, you know, in terms of triangulation of data, we tried to address lots of different themes here and then retest those themes using a slightly different process to see if we still came out with the same results. So eventually we shortlisted 9 organisations for face-to-face interview, and we sent out those, and Sophie then triggered the formal review, the formal procurement review. But unfortunately, that's when we hit the lockdown period, which is all rather sudden. And so we had to take a really sensible, I think, action to pause the review for the time being, because there's absolutely no way we could expect the procurement people to be helping us at this particular moment. So to allow them to focus on the crisis period, and of course procurement was right at the forefront of that. So that's really where we've got to at the moment, and that's the approach that we took. Thank you, Sophie. So I think, you know, Sophie, reading through the findings that you can see it in the report, and we did collect masses of evidence. What would you consider to be good procurement examples in your view?
Thanks, Jane. So we did find quite a number of good examples in the research phase that we conducted. I guess the biggest challenge that we found was this kind of disconnect between the wellbeing objectives that public bodies had set and what they were actually doing then in terms of their procurement. One of the best examples that we saw was in Carmarthenshire, in terms of the procurement of schools, where Carmarthenshire have set 15 wellbeing objectives. And in the procurement of their schools through the 21st Century Schools programme, they actually were meeting 10 out of their 15 objectives. So They've got an objective on looking after the environment. That was considered in the procurement phase. So the schools that they've built are to BREEAM and Passive House standard. They've got an objective about creating local jobs. And the way in which they did their procurement was really focusing on local suppliers. They've got an objective around better use of council resources. So they'd really considered that in the way that they were building the school and thinking about the long term and the reduced maintenance costs and so on associated with the approach that they took. There were a few areas, even in that one where possibly they could have gone a bit further. So they've got an objective around improving transport infrastructure. They had built in improvements to the kind of road network around the school as part of their contracting process there, but had missed opportunities to make the connection to active travel. So what we would really want to be seeing is, they've got this objective on looking after the environment and improving the transport network. What do those two things together mean? Probably they don't mean constructing more roads. They probably mean a focus on active travel and public transport and so on. But overall, a really good example. We've seen lots of other examples where public bodies are definitely collaborating. So the 3 fire and rescue services have got a joint procurement strategy. That's really good. There's lots of work going on in the Gwent Regional Partnership Board around the Commission of Social Care. Lots of work going on in housing associations in that region as well, really trying to identify local suppliers and the vast majority of local suppliers in terms of construction and so on in the Blaenau Gwent area have 9 or less employees. So these kind of micro businesses. And they are doing what is really essential, that kind of initial mapping to look at, who are these people or these businesses? Do we know them? Are they providing sort of services or facilities and so on that products that we want to buy? And let's understand how we can collectively kind of shift our procurement approach towards that. So we also found lots of good examples of where public bodies were using the spirit of the Act, but not necessarily connecting that back to their own wellbeing objectives. And, I think those public bodies have got to be praised for doing that. So we were seeing lots, for example, on, change in practice in terms of the approach to waste, change in practice in terms of canteen facilities, biodegradable cups, so on and so on. And that's really good. But if we want to really drive progress across the wellbeing goals, what we need to be doing is making sure that the way in which we are procuring is directly connected back to the wellbeing objectives set by public bodies. The statutory kind of duty, if you like, is to set wellbeing objectives that maximise your contribution to the goals, and then take all reasonable steps to meet those objectives. And if we're missing out the £6 billion that we spend on public sector procurement in making that connection, I think to me it's pretty clear that we're not taking all reasonable steps. So some really good things to learn from out there, but it's that strategic connection back to wellbeing objectives that's really important. So Jane, in terms of the work that you did, we've heard about those kind of good examples and so on. What, in terms of the findings from the review, do you think are the most significant? I mentioned that some of these seem to be kind of ongoing, intractable problems. Can you just explain a little bit more from your long background in this area? What do you think are the kind of key issues for the here and now in terms of how we implement procurement in line with the Future Generations Act?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Sophie. So, of course, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I think, what the overall view that we took from observing and analysing this data was that, all public bodies appear to be embracing the spirit of the Act. They all appear to be taking steps towards applying elements of the Act, but at the time of conducting the research, there was little consistency of any, thinking about how individual organisation objectives were aligned to the wellbeing goals. Again, I'd like to think about, and I know Sophie highlighted that were lots of examples of collaboration, but actually, if you think about the different ways of working that are highlighted in the Act, I would like to think about this one about prevention. So if we're thinking about long-term thinking and prevention, we actually saw very little evidence in that particular area. And of course, it's only based on the evidence that was presented to us. So I'm not saying that it isn't happening. I'm just saying that the evidence that was presented to us, there was very little understanding about really how we can prevent a future situation from occurring. And I can see some really interesting questions coming through the Q&A here, which relate to some of this. And so please do keep those questions coming forward. I think one of the other real big areas here is this stigma around procurement. I mean, what is it with procurement? You know, we constantly seem to be fighting. It's not just, you know, public sector. It's not just in Wales. This is a procurement profession problem. You know, I've been involved in so many discussions about this. Why is it that we're always the last to be involved in the conversation, but when things go wrong, they're the first people that seem to be flagged up as the root cause of the problem? The procurement profession has always struggled to gain the strategic recognition that it deserves. And I feel that that came across quite strongly from some of the feedback that we had in the emails as coming back from some of the participants. So some of the feedback that we had is said, this is not just about skills, this is also about mindset. So, you know, these are huge cultural shifts that we're talking about here. So for procurement not to be involved in early communication within and across organisations, you know, that's really quite worrying. So let's remember that, you know, this is at the time that we were collecting this evidence, which was at the start of the year. There didn't seem to be any integrated implementation at Welsh Government level. It seemed to be all policy making in isolation. So this is another one of the comments that came forward and is in the report. No single constant definition of value. And that's one of the points that I raised at the start, is this issue with definitions. But I would also ask that whilst we, you know, in Wales are needing to comply with the legislation, what we need to maybe think about is, do different regions have different strategic priorities in terms of what value represents? So maybe this is an area that needs a lot more investigation to really understand what the value priorities are for each region. Another term that came forward in the feedback was this best value hurdle. Public sector still sees lowest prices driving decision making on procurement, which is further impacted by austerity measures and budget cuts. That's an actual quote that we have in our report. When are we ever going to stop this focus on cost and then value afterwards? So, you know, we've still got a long way to go. So some fantastic examples going on, but there's still a long way to go. And a lot of this does require a different way of thinking. So some of the other issues identified include leadership. And by that, I mean having procurement sitting at the top table in discussions, in the most strategic discussions. So for high spend items, for example, how and when is procurement involved in the procurement decisions? And quite often we've seen where it's a little bit too late when they're involved, and then they're scrambling to try and find the right suppliers for those particular projects. For a small country, we have a very complex landscape. And by that, I don't just mean our geographical spread, which is well known to everybody living in Wales and working in Wales. What I mean by that is our capacity and resources issue. Wales has got multiple policies, but few professionals on the ground to actually deliver them. And this is something I think I've said at practically every public event that I've attended. This makes it difficult and more challenging to move from process-based procurement to outcomes-based procurement. Procuring sustainably and investing in longer-term decisions which will impact our future generations. This is the kind of mindset that we need to be starting to adopt. Now, culture was one of the other areas that came out, and Sophie may be able to provide some case examples of this later on. But actually, the cultural dimension of wellbeing was the least evidence dimension of the procurement examples that were shared as part of our research. So an example of culture-related wellbeing objective means building resilient communities, the culture, the language, for example, enabling access to leisure and cultural activities, promoting Welsh language and culture. So really, there needs to be further knowledge about sharing different sectors and work happening in different communities. Generally, the wellbeing objectives linked to culture are not necessarily integrated into other areas and are less ambitious objectives than the other dimensions of wellbeing. So again, what we're seeing here is a replication between what we see in the academic literature, where culture is not maybe such a well-researched area, and actually what's going on in practice here. So from my point of view, I'd like to see some more work in that particular area. So Sophie, based on this review so far, what are your actual recommendations for public bodies in Wales?
Well, there's some, I suppose, strategic recommendations, particularly around the issues that have already been flagged around this sort of role of leadership in placing procurement in as a higher level of priority, if you like, and connecting back to those sort of strategic leadership decisions. I think in terms of the review, the statutory review that we're going to take forward, that is one of the areas that I particularly want to explore further. It seems to me that procurement, what goes on around the kind of board table or cabinet or what have you, is completely disconnected often from what is happening with procurement professionals, and what procurement does is seen as some sort of dark arts and wizardry that nobody understands. Yes, it is complex, but it's actually really straightforward as well, which is, every public body has particular objectives, wellbeing objectives in this case, that they're trying to meet, and procurement, is a real lever to help them to meet those objectives. And if they start from that point, and if they start to reflect on how, therefore, those connections need to be made, how that function needs to be resourced, looking at it in a kind of invest-to-save type model, then I think that we might start to have some significantly different outcomes. We want to stop public bodies procuring in a short-term way or a transactional way and obsessing over process, and start longer-term thinking and planning. That's really important if we are going to do this work, engaging with micro businesses, identifying the right sort of supply chains, and so on. We do need a revised national procurement policy statement. The last one was in 2015, before the Act came into force, and it's important that we have that sort of national strategic overarching policy which aligns with the Future Generations Act. But I'd also kind of caution, or counsel a bit of caution there, in that what we don't want is another plethora of guidance, tools, so on and so on. Procurement professionals told us that they're absolutely inundated with all this stuff. And what we found in our spotlight on procurement really does echo a number of findings across implementation of the whole Future Generations Act, which is, it's really important that we use the framework, the legal framework of the Act as the starting point. Legislation comes first, policy comes second. And what we're finding is policy from Welsh Government is often using slightly different language, or taking you off in a slightly different direction, or not making the connection. So where we've got the code of conduct on ethical supply chains, for example, that's really good. But why are we not connecting that very clearly back to, if you do that, you are meeting your obligations under the Wellbeing Future Generations Act in terms of being globally responsible, in terms of the goal of a prosperous Wales, and a range of others. And again, sort of, new initiatives, the work that's going on in terms of the foundational economy, really supportive of that, absolutely aligned within the Future Generations Act. But let's explain it in that way. Let's not have it as this sort of separate thing which is being done over there, because I think that's one of the key reasons why attention is kind of distracted to whatever the new show in town is, and there's always a new show in town, rather than actually this. We spent a lot of time, effort, and are internationally, leading the world in putting in place this legal framework. For God's sake, let's use that. leadership to make this happen, support and investing to save in the procurement profession, and recognising that as a kind of key element of delivering wellbeing objectives, procuring for the long term, and let's clean up the kind of the frameworks, the system, and so on that we're operating within, and certainly stop adding more complexity and layers to it. So I think those are the kind of key recommendations from the review, or the research phase of the review so far. When we get back into the more detailed review, there's likely to be some further recommendations, which, as it's a statutory review, will require formal response and so on. But of course, we're now in a kind of a different context and a different environment with COVID. And I think that, in many ways, that's really, really interesting. It is presenting us with many challenges, and if the forecasts are right, that's going to continue and get significantly worse. But it also presents us with a number of opportunities. Never, so many times in 3 months have I heard people talking about green jobs, green recovery, a focus on changing the way that we live and work. In many ways, COVID has kind of fast forwarded things that were happening anyway, and are getting people to kind of completely think in different ways. Who'd have thought, for example, that we might be able to solve our M4 congestion problem with mass home working? I thought it a little while ago, but I don't think it was accepted by the mainstream, and now that is a reality. But we've also seen some completely different and quite exciting approaches in terms of response to procurement in the COVID landscape. And I think I'm going to ask you, Jane, to tell us some of your highlights there, because I know you've been looking at them. But for me, I think what that's, the response to that, and the way in which we have adopted this kind of can-do mindset, that there has been that strategic connection back to, oh God, we're in a crisis, let's not, quick just, buy stuff that we need. But there has actually been a focus from the top, from the government, filtered down into individual public bodies of, no, let's buy this in a way which is going to have multiple benefits. I think that that's a really good example of the things that we can do. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more detail about some of those examples, Jane.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, I think this period has been actually quite incredible, what we've seen in terms of procurement. So I think what we've seen is extraordinary action. It's been quite remarkable, and we've really observed accelerated innovation, open innovation on a grand scale. What I also have really been pleased to see is this integration between buy and supply side. So many times I've been in meetings where maybe is where the resource should be invested, and they say, well, actually no, that's not our responsibility. That's the buy side, that's the supply side responsibility, that's the Department for Economy's responsibility. But actually what we've seen is the Department for Economy and procurement coming together much more to provide a commercial approach to procurement. So I think there's been much more focus and understanding of the significance of the supply chain, and that's both been, of course, good and bad. Knowing your market opportunities and supply chain gaps or voids has obviously been critical in this process. So I think, really, I think it's been quite remarkable what we've seen in terms of the progression, and I only hope that this is just the start of something for the future and where we can build. So I think the crisis period has not just affected the way that we procure. So changes in regulations, for example, about accepting open innovation. It's really about thinking about businesses that have survived through this, have had to completely rethink their business models and offering. And some of my, one of my favourite examples was particularly the Royal Mint example. Coin manufacturing capabilities, designing a medical visor, and gaining mass production within 48 hours. I mean, it was just incredible, absolutely incredible. But when you go back to the well-being, look what that did. That secured jobs. It created a huge feeling of collegiality amongst the workforce, And there was this pressure and this real surgence to want to do and make a difference. So I think, this was a tremendous example, and you can see the illustration of that on page 131 in the report. I think the supply of PPE has always been out to question, with 90% of Wales, and I've certainly raised questions over this, with PPE, 90% of PPE supplies coming from overseas. But delighted that Deputy Minister Lee Waters has been encouraging more domestic production. We had about 13 million pieces of PPE being used every week at the start of the pandemic. This dropped to around about 8 million pieces at the end of May. I'm not quite sure where we are at the moment. But since the start of March, more than 126 million pieces of PPE have been used in Wales. This is huge demand, but it brings great opportunity to develop supply chains in Wales. And we've now got 50 suppliers in Wales who are actually providing some of this equipment. So I'm really, really pleased to see some of that coming through. But of course, some of these things take time, and critiques were very quick to step in, to be able to change what you do, and to be able to rethink your business process, and to be able to adapt the materials that you require, and then also specify to quality standards does take time. So in many ways, we've learned an awful lot from this crisis period, which hopefully will prepare us for the future. In the background, I've also been doing some work with my ERSP colleagues on an international research study on COVID, and looking at the procurement response across, I think we have responses from 23 different countries. So we'll be hopefully sharing some of that information with you very soon. I also saw, Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre Cymru have adapted capabilities to produce an order of 10,000 ventilators in Welsh Government-owned facility in Broughton. So again, great example. You can refer to that example on page 131 of the report. And great to see some of those questions coming through. Thank you. So I think the stage of the meeting, we're actually bang on with our timing. I think we're 9:13, and I think we scheduled this for 9:15, but there's I think we've got 15, I don't know if they're all questions, but we've got 15 points that have been raised. So if you've got any questions to raise, now's the time to get those questions in quickly. Really now, I turn to Kevin to really lead us and help us with some of these questions, where he thinks that we may be able to address some of your queries based on some of the things that we've raised today.
Well, I've been trying to monitor the Q&A as they come in, and we've had some really good questions. We won't have time, obviously, to address them all, but we can assure everybody that we'll get back to everybody when we go through the points, the comments, and the Q&As. I can give you that assurance now. But in terms of addressing some of them, Duncan Forbes has long campaigned and argued that collaboration in some respects is overrated and is inappropriate in all cases. What does the panel think? What does Sophie and Jane think as to whether there's a danger about collaborating where that leads to aggregating big contracts, biased then towards big suppliers, cutting out small and SME type suppliers? To what extent is that an issue, Jane or Sophie?
Shall I go first?
Fine, yeah.
I think Duncan raises a really good point here, and of course that was some of the the challenges with the National Procurement Service and so on, because there was this challenge between I suppose an approach of a number of years ago, which was buy big because of the the cost savings around buying big, versus what are the new requirements under the Future Generations Act, which is demonstrate how you're connecting back to your local objectives and achieving those in your area. So I do think there are probably some contracts that should remain at a higher regional or national level, but I think each one has got to be considered individually. I think the really important area where collaboration needs to happen, though, is probably a PSB area initially, possibly broadening towards regions. Growth deals, for example, I know that a number of the growth deals are looking at this. But to really map and understand what collectively it is that they're buying, and then what is within their area, which businesses and so on are operating in that way, and really considering then across to their wellbeing objectives and to the national wellbeing goals, how collectively, either collectively or individually in smaller sort of lots, would we procure to best contribute to the objectives that we're trying to achieve. And certainly, we've got the Centre for Local Economic Strategies now working with a number of public services boards to try to instill some of the thinking around the approach that was taken in Preston, for example, where exactly that happened. I think that's really important. I had lots of discussions with Claire. They are very keen on embedding the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I suppose there's just a slight word of caution there that we do have 7 goals to cover in the Future Generations Act. So just focusing on the kind of foundational economy and so on won't be enough. We also need to be thinking about decarbonisation. We also need to be thinking about that element that Jane mentioned, culture, which is widely missing from very many contracts that we've looked at. But I think a collaborative approach certainly has its place, as long as that collaborative approach is then taking action in a way which is connecting back to those local objectives. And for example, the NHS shared services, we saw a real disconnect there. They were doing some really good stuff on a national level, but very little connection back to the individual objectives of health boards, for example.
Jane, any thoughts?
Loads. I could run a whole breakfast seminar on collaboration alone. I think, my work with ICW, the Institute for Collaborative Working, and really thinking about what was BS 11000 and now ISO 44001. Again, it comes back to this use of terms, and I get the point about aggregation, not being effective collaboration, because it potentially excludes the local market, because we're looking at aggregating a higher level of spend, and so it creates lots of barriers to entry for small businesses and particularly micro firms, of which, of course, we have many of them in Wales, not just in Wales, but many other countries as well. So I think really what we need to be clear about is, what do we mean by collaboration? And if we are serious about collaboration in Wales, I agree with Sophie, it has to start at the top. So the public service boards, and I think also even at cabinet secretary level, and we're already starting to see that. Collaboration needs to be managed in a structured way. And it's really important to think about this alignment of goals, and where we see collaboration go wrong is where those kind of considerations have never really those kind of considerations have never really taken place. I've run lots of workshops on this, and quite often what you see is that a project arrives on the desk. We think, right, who should we invite to the first meeting? Everybody sits around the table with this meeting. They think, right, how do we get started? Nobody really stops to think about what their actual organisation objectives are and why collaboration is the right approach. So what will collaboration do to help this project? Why will it add value to this particular project? And so collaboration, is a really strategic vehicle. And I would even argue that, companies that do collaboration well, if you go onto the ICW website, you'll see logos of absolutely hundreds of companies, really large companies, that embrace collaboration and take it really seriously. This is at the board level. This collaboration runs through the veins of these people, a little bit like sustainability. So you could almost argue that collaboration isn't just a strategy. It's almost becoming philosophical within the organisation. It becomes an orientation within the business. And I don't see any different to happening in the public sector as well. And I've seen some great examples of that happening, as Sophie has highlighted as well. So I think, what we need to be careful of is how we use the term collaboration. And collaboration is important. I mean, there's absolutely stacks of research linking collaboration and innovation. 2 heads are better than 1. Bringing people together around a table to solve a problem, particularly useful when you've got smaller businesses where problem solving, and as we've hit this crisis period, having to think very differently, and particularly as we go into the economic challenging period that we're about to face, collaboration is going to be absolutely at the forefront of what we do going forward.
Yeah,
and that we're going to have to be working.
But collaboration's important, but it's a means, isn't it? It's not an end. And if we're talking about ends, we're talking about delivery, we're talking about impact. Sue Harrell, for example, has a question in the Q&A where she says, should there be more focus in Wales on outcomes, on outcome-oriented procurement? And should we have some kind of legal basis for that, as they do in Scotland? Sophie?
We've got a legal basis. It's called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Those are the outcomes. It's a long-term vision for the Wales that we want to see. Procurement is clearly identified in the statutory guidance as a lever to achieve those long-term outcomes. The local outcomes are the wellbeing objectives, which are set, designed to maximise the contribution to those national goals. So, I keep coming back to the point. We need to stop reinventing the wheel. We need to start from that basis and kind of work back. Not dabble in certain areas and then try to sort of fit it later to the Future Generations Act, or not think about the Future Generations Act and those longer term goals at all. We've done the work in that space. We're the only country in the world that has set out a statutory long-term vision of the Wales that we want to see. Every procurement decision should be following that framework. So, maybe there's some sort of technical, guidance or what have you that's needed to pull all of that together. But I'm not sure that it's new legislation, because it's there. We just need to use it effectively.
Jane?
I totally agree. Definitely. I mean, I mentioned earlier, I agree that collaboration is a process, but it's also an enabler. So, and as Sophie says, if we're bringing organisations together to try and make a difference, then we need to look at those goals first. There it is. That's the outcome. The outcome is to address those goals, and how bringing organisations together within the public sector and engaging with the local community can actually help us address and achieve those goals. And I think that's how collaboration is really vital for that part of the process.
Liz Lucas is asking us, what are the top 5 outcomes that we should be looking for in Wales in the next 2 years? Sophie?
I think there's kind of a few on process and, thinking in a different way, and then a few, I suppose, kind of, key policy outcomes for me. So I think on different ways of thinking, I do think that we need to start with what is it that we're trying to achieve. How then do we go about kind of procuring that in a way which is going to maximise benefit, but also asking us the question sometimes of, do we actually need to procure that service or that building or whatever it might be at all? Because I think that there's something about us being stuck in a particular mindset. And as I say, the M4 is a brilliant example of that. We've got a problem with congestion. We need to procure a road. We need to build a road. That's the kind of traditional thinking. Or we've got a problem with loneliness and isolation. We need to commission a befriending service or whatever it might be. Actually, I think, when we start making the connections back to what are sort of future trends and scenarios that are at play, and what might that tell us about, what might be happening in the short, medium and long term. When we think about the wider objectives, okay, so it's not just that we're trying to deal with the problem of congestion, it's actually that we're trying to improve people's health, it's that we're trying to decarbonise, it's that we're trying to protect and enhance nature, it's that we're trying to find a solution which will have the best impact for those who are in socioeconomic disadvantage. We get a completely different kind of picture. So let's start with the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and then decide how to take that forward. I suppose the next step then is, what's the art of the possible? So if we are going to procure a service, or we are going to build a building infrastructure, what have you, how can we do that in a way which considers those multiple benefits? So, I often think now about the, if I was in the housing sector or in the construction sector, I'd be preparing now for a green economic stimulus package around housing retrofit. That's brilliant. That's the what we're going to do, really important. The how we do it is really critical, because we could do that by shipping in a massive company from the south of England, and it could deliver all of that across Wales and so on. Or we could do that by supporting the foundation economy. We could think about, when we're doing that, could we actually build in additionality to it? Could we be thinking about green infrastructure in our towns and communities? Could we be thinking about how we build in kind of cultural elements to the way in which we might do some design, construction, whatever? I think that there's just, a huge range of possibilities. If we track from our starting point across each one of the wellbeing goals and ask ourselves, what is the art of the possible on this? And then I think that, in terms of, I'd like to see a longer term and, where appropriate, collaborative approach to procurement, understanding the local environment and what's possible there, and planning kind of for the long term. Back to housing retrofit and things like modern methods of construction. We could lead the way here in Wales with saying we have a long-term plan for this to be our approach. We're therefore going to commit to that long-term financing of that, and that would enable us to focus on building supply chain, building the skills that's needed, and so on. So that long-term approach. And then I suppose finally, I'm not sticking to 5, but there are a number of areas in which I think are going to be really critical for us to be addressing. So decarbonisation and nature loss. If you're not considering that in your contracts, you're quite frankly, you're not being a good ancestor, and you're probably not legally compliant either. The issues around inequality, so inequality, socioeconomic disadvantage, and inequality of particular groups. We should be considering that in the way that we spend our money. Jobs and skills, and how the way we spend our money are going to be supporting jobs and skills for the future, not just jobs and skills of the here and now. So thinking about those future, the future demand for particular types of skills, and then things around kind of community and our population. So ageing population, increasing loneliness and isolation, and disconnection between communities. When we're procuring things, particularly in terms of infrastructure and indeed services, we should be thinking about all of those things.
Many thanks, Sophie. As we're about to run out of time, folks, can I just say 2 things before I hand you over to my colleague Sarah? First of all, a warm thank you to all of you who've devoted some time to join us this morning. It's an enormously important issue, procuring for well-being, and particularly as part of the post-COVID recovery. We've all got to raise our game in Wales, and we'll be engaging with everyone in terms of the Q&A debate, loads of questions, and I promise we'll get back to all of you. So many thanks for joining us, and I now hand over to my colleague Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin, Jane and Sophie. It was a really great exploration of this critical issue for Wales. And thanks again to everyone for joining us. As Kevin said, we will be following up on all your Q&A. So sorry if we didn't get round to it, but as you can see, it's a busy session. We had 175 people join us at its peak. And just a little flag that we've also got a session with James Timpson, the CEO of Timpson, talking about how they've made it through COVID. They've done some fantastic practices in terms of fair tax, in terms of the living wage. So we'd be really keen to hear how they've coped with their COVID-19 journey. So thanks ever so much for coming, everybody. Apologies again for the slight technical difficulties at the beginning of the session. I feel slightly relaxed now, guys, but it was tense there for a while. The joys of technology and the internet. So hopefully one day we'll all be back together in these Ed suites. But in the interim, we'll do our best to keep delivering these fantastic interactive webinar sessions for you all. Thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks.